Okay, friends, today we have on the phone, we have Peleh ben Avraham. He's a Karaite teacher. He has many great videos on YouTube, and I think that you guys are in for an interesting discussion, a Torah discussion, and this discussion is really going to be focused on where we differ. So go ahead.
Yeah, just want to let you know that I watched quite a few of your videos, over a period of over a year, and I do respect your views on a lot of topics and things like that. And I think your message thoroughly is pure in trying to help people, and that's what I'm trying to do as well. Try to help as many people as possible. I'm not out for myself. I'm just trying to help people, and being able to help someone just be able to fly on their own journey with Elohim. That's the ultimate goal with what I'm doing. And that's why I don't really have a donation button or, anything like that, because I'm thoroughly doing it just to help people. That's my goal.
What is your YouTube page so the listeners could look it up?
Servant of the YHWH and then capitals alone. So Servant of YHWH alone. You'll see it should come up. It should pop up right away on the very top, and you'll see my channel.
Awesome. I'm going to let you run this discussion and see where we differ and where we really unite in. I think it'll be interesting hearing both sides. Go ahead.
Yeah, sounds great. I have a couple videos where I present a case for the Karaite point of view based on Tanakh, how I believe that it was a written document and not something orally translated. I could start naming off some passages and reading some verses here that I believe are very, very clear that we are to understand that this was something that was written down. And, for example, some of the passages that are really...
Hey, hold on. How does that contrast what I believe? Because I think that we may agree in this area. What do you think my position is?
I know that you don't follow Kabbalah and other things that were additions that are solution of what true Judaism really is and what the Creator really wanted. He forbids anything to do with the supernatural and things of that nature, and I believe that Kabbalah and other things are going off the page. It's not a personal attack on anyone who follows it personally, but, we have to stay true. Like myself, I would agree with that. Another thing, too, what I agree completely with you about, which I don't agree with traditional Judaism and Karaites as well, some claim to be Karaites, is the fact that they believe that you're not supposed to teach anyone or put your message out there to reach out to help people, which I think is completely contrary against Tanakh, and I can prove that in many cases. Yeah, exactly. Like they're just not welcome into the fold. We have a lot of trouble with that in Karaism in general, where a lot of, I'm not going to name individuals, but there are some people that are claiming to represent the Karaites, and they're not very welcoming to outsiders, and it's really, I've actually found that one of the things I found was that they're literally closing the conversions and opening them up, then closing them again, kind of letting their favorites in, and then closing the door, which that's what basically made me not want to go to the synagogue anymore, in general.
Well, traditionally, Karaite Jews didn't perform conversions and didn't accept conversions. The traditional Karaite Jews from Egypt, the Karaite shul you find in the Old City in Jerusalem, this modern Karaite movement, under the rubric of Nehemiah Gordon, that's a different type of Karaite movement. I don't think the traditional Karaites accept this new movement as actual Karaites. Trust me, I prefer the modern movement than the traditional one.
Yeah, no, I'm actually in agreement with you. There's a lot of differences between what modern Karaites, for example, you had a conversation with another Karaite that was basically stating what is and isn't, but a lot of that is actually against the Karaite creeds as well, and then we have people that are claiming to represent Karaism that's trying to basically discredit Nehemiah's teachings and his knowledge, where he studied a lot about the ancient traditions of Karaism, and he's been living in Israel for many, many years, and if anybody can know what he's talking about, it's definitely him. There's others too as well in Israel who are true Karaites that actually know what they're talking about, and they're not for a lot of what's going on here in the States as far as alleged leaders that are doing this kind of thing. As far as conversions go, there is not really much mention about that kind of thing in general, but definitely the creeds of Karaism does not reject those who want to join being part of Israel. And I base my teachings on Tanakh, not really on Karaite creeds. So if we look at Tanakh, it's very clear that the Gentiles are welcome to the covenant. Of course, you can't have any Tom, Dick, or Harry join the covenant who just picks up a Tanakh and says, I'm a Karaite. You have to be very serious about your dedication and become a Torah-observant Jew.
We follow the standards in the Talmud in terms of how to accept converts. Are you saying that every Karaite community has their own standards on how they accept who they want to accept?
No, I can't speak for every community at all, but I can only speak for at least the majority consensus of what you're seeing, like on, for example, on Facebook, and you're seeing it from Daly City as well. I mean, there's a lot of sweet people, individuals that are very open, but there seems to be this kind of shut and close the door and open it up. Like, for example, they have a website called KJU, which is Karaite Judaism University, and it was up and running for a couple years, and they closed it down. What I was getting the notion from several Karaites is that it was closed down because of basically they weren't handling their own conversions, and that it was basically run through Orthodox permission, and that they weren't allowing it at the moment. They were waiting to get it reopened. But then I came to find out from other places that, in fact, it was them themselves that closed down the conversions, and they basically open it up every few years, let in a couple of their favorites, and then close it down again. And I just thought that was really wrong, and it's against Scripture. Yeah, it's very corrupted.
I think this argues for a uniform understanding of law and tradition, like more than anything else, on how you accept newcomers. If everyone is left up to their own understanding how they're going to accept people into the religion, into the citizenship of biblical Israel, then by definition, you're always going to have splits. You're never going to be able to unite because people won't accept your converts and vice versa. Rabbinic Jews adhere to the standards that appear in the Mishnah and in the Talmud on how to accept converts. And that's a standard that we can always point to and say, hey, you're outside of the script. You're missing the mark because we have a standard to point to. But if everything is left up in the air, then it would never progress socially because you could never unite on anything.
That's true. I mean, in a sense, I agree with coming together with the point of view. But I think it's been a little exaggerated as far as everybody comes up with their own rules and regulations. I think it kind of went a little bit. That's what the notion is coming across, because we always say that each individual keeps the Torah. The consensus is that every Karaite interprets the Torah any way they want, and that's not really what's going on. It has to be based and really strongly based on Tanakh, and it can't be. Of course, there is an argument that says that, you know, we have our own tradition or our own, so to speak, Talmudic traditions, which is, you know, it's not necessarily saying we can kind of dig into that more, because I really want to help people understand the differences. We do have traditions, but the difference is that we don't claim those traditions, or like, you cannot disagree with these traditions, or this is not what Karaism is. Like, it's not dogmatic where you have to do things a certain way, this way. You know, if it's against Scripture, period. Basically, the true Karaite creeds are that Tanakh alone is the authority. So if it goes against the Scripture, which I know you're very much admirable about keeping, is that if it's not based on Scripture, we gotta take Scripture over any tradition. That's one of the things I do respect about your message too. But that's the same thing here. Is like, even though somebody may, come as a Karaite and say, well, the Torah says this, but I'm going to do this because I'm going to interpret it this way. That's not the way it works. Somebody can't just invent something. It has to be strongly based on Tanakh and clear as well. It can't be abstract.
But like, for example, what ruling body do you have to decide if your understanding of how a custom is translated is valid?
Well, we base it on the Scripture. We believe the authority is Elohim. Bottom line is, we believe it's clear in the Scripture.
I'm pretty sure you've met people who use the Scripture to behave immorally.
Yeah, but within Karaism, though, people who are Karaites who are serious about Karaism, they don't do it that way. Like, they don't use it to, I've never met anyone who tried to do that kind of thing and go off the page, except if they were not serious about something or just learning, had some incidents like that. But serious Karaites...
Who are you accountable to? At least in Judaism, we are accountable to the rabbis in the Mishnah. In other words, there's so much information in there that it covers every aspect of life. But it seems that you guys are above the law, in the sense that there's many people throughout the centuries who views the scriptures to justify immoral behavior. And you don't have a ruling body to say, no, we're going this way on this ceremonial law or ceremonial practice. Then what you have is chaos and really just an attempt to disorganize religion.
Well, it's not chaotic. It's interpreted that way as chaotic, but really in reality, there's really no chaos because we all basically agree on the scriptural. Basically, fundamentally, everything is based on the scripture and is already an agreement ahead of time, on what is clear and what is not, and things that are not so clear on the serious things, like for example Shabbat and things like that. Those things are very, very clear to us. And things of minor things, like for example, some people, will wear tefillin or things like that. Even though it's rabbinical, some people will like to interpret it literal, whereas you can either take it literal or figurative. It depends. Because we use the example, says to tie the Torah around your parts, things like that. We find many references to things like that. So the majority of Karaites would take those things that are taken literally by rabbinical Judaism as being more figurative than, physically.
The command actually goes both ways. It appears twice in Torah. And in one, it calls it an ot, that it should be a sign. A sign is something you see, but that's not here or there. But how do you think that I view Tanakh? Because you started off making a statement on the way you view it in contrast to how I view it, and I think that maybe we might view it the same.
Probably what I would say is correct that statement. We do take some of the rabbinical statements as basically our guide to keeping certain mitzvot and things like that, whereas I believe that you can thoroughly understand Torah law through the Torah itself. Like, for example, I've had a conversation with other Orthodox Jews, and they basically, well, how do you know how to do this? How do you know how to tie this? And for us, it's just not there. It's because it was not deemed a necessary thing to add more detail. It's very simple. Like, say, well, how do you know how to, for example, sacrifice an animal? How do you know how to do it right, how to slaughter the animal? And I think it's very clear that the point of the slaughtering is to drain the blood as water and pour it on the ground. The basis, the understanding is that to not consume blood. That's what we would focus on. What is made complicated as far as.
So it doesn't matter how you slaughter the animal? I mean, you could.
No, it doesn't matter. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm not saying it doesn't matter.
For example, the Torah doesn't explain how to slaughter cattle properly. I could also translate slaughter in the way that I showed you to mean the covering of the blood, but it's not explicit. And
no, it's not explicit, but
it's not explicit that we're allowed to eat meat outside of animals that we slaughter. Something that Rabbinic Judaism instituted is that outside of the temple, we're now allowed to eat meat even though we don't have sacrifices. Or, for example, how to keep Shabbat. Torah doesn't tell you exactly what labor is, what melacha is, but it says don't do created labor. What does that actually mean? I think in the Karaite camp, it causes confusion.
Yeah, I mean, in general, a lot of times it's mistranslated as work, which that's not a proper translation of it whatsoever. I agree. Melacha in general, we understand it as basically a task or a means to an end. Say whatever is not a task or means to an end would be okay to do is, for example,
who sits aside in the Karaite world if it's being kept properly or not? Who are you accountable to? At least the rabbi said, okay, there are 39 categories of melacha, and then there are subcategories to those. Everyone in Judaism acknowledges this as landmarks, place to unite on. Just because it is ambiguous, I don't think it's clear for anyone to say that I know how Torah expects me to keep Shabbat. It sounds that as a Karaite Jew, it would be hard for you to eat in other people's houses on Shabbat because perhaps they slaughter their animals differently, or perhaps they're eating animals. You never found a justification to slaughter animals outside of sacrificing them when the Torah really doesn't give that allowance. What I use as my norms to how to properly translate Torah is what you call tradition. You have a tradition among Karaite Jews how things are done and what's accepted. And this is how Rabbinic Jews view the oral law, a basic explanation on how to translate Torah laws into daily life. And without that, I don't think that Jews could progress socially because there would be way too much confusion.
So what we would answer, for example, in Deuteronomy Devarim chapter 31, it states that it was to read the Torah every 7 years in the ears of every man, woman, and child, and the servants. The fact that the children could hear and learn to keep the Torah. Like that would be one of many examples of scriptures. For example, we look at the
who reads it? And what do you read in the Torah?
Well, the point I'm trying to make, I know, but the point that I'm trying to make here is the point is who is listening and who is learning to keep the Torah. It states very clearly and explicitly that those who hear can learn to fear and keep even the children.
I accept that, but just within that chapter, there's so much gray area that you need support to solidify on who actually reads it, what's being read. Now, this is called...
No, I have nothing against that.
Right? So every year it's read, the non-Jews are placed in front, and the rabbis say, why? Learn what Torah is.
No, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with that. I'm not... That's what the
oral is.
What I'm here. I'm trying to say that the point is who is the listeners? Who is the ones who are benefiting from the reading? And when you find passages like this, like, for example, in Joshua chapter 8, for example, I'll sort of just state one passage here. This is one of my favorites here to state. In Joshua chapter 8, for example, it's just from verses 34 through 35. It says right here, after that he, Yehoshua, read all the words of the Torah, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the scroll of the Torah. There was not a word of all that Moshe commanded that Yehoshua did not read to the entire congregation of Israel, the women, the children, and all the converts that walked among them. And that's how the chapter ends. It doesn't say, and then he explained the oral Torah. You know, I'm not saying that that's the whole base of our argument, but these are passages that we would use to show that, for example, whenever these explicit statements come off, where he's reading every single word of the Torah that was written down, you never find the statement right after, and then he explained the oral Torah. And then he had the rabbis explain, which I know the rabbis didn't exist, but I mean...
We don't view the oral Torah like that. The oral Torah are the rulings of the court.
Well, whichever way they use it, whatever way you use it, or however we explain it, why isn't it, like, I'm just saying from the Karaite point of view, I'm not doing it in a challenging way. I'm just saying,
I could explain
in general, this would be our argument.
Sure, the word Torah just means instructions.
And light, the root for light.
Whenever the word Torah is used, it almost never refers to the Torah scroll completely. In other words, it refers to the instructions within the Torah.
Well, here it is, though. No, not here, though. Yehoshua, it's very clear that the Torah was already written down here. Do you disagree with that passage, or
it's not the same?
Why would you disagree with that?
It means the instructions within the Torah, not the actual narrative as it's being told over. Are you going to say that in Deuteronomy chapter 26 the Torah didn't exist? No, the Torah existed, the instructions existed, but the actual narrative that appears in the 5 books is not considered the Torah. The book of Genesis is not considered the Torah. Torah means instructions. Right. In Genesis itself, there's only 2 commands given in the whole book. Right, nowadays, we consider it Torah. I have no problem calling it Torah. But to say that every word of the Torah was being read by Joshua about 2 years after the death of Moses, that's kind of hard to explain. Because we even believe Joshua wrote...
I don't think it's too hard to explain. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 24 through 26, it states very clearly that Moshe finished writing down all the words of the Torah on a parchment scroll until he was completed them. So Moshe commanded Leviim, the bearer of the Ark of the Covenant of Adonai, and said, take this book, or however you want to translate, scroll for the English listeners, and put it at the side of the Ark of the Covenant of Adonai your Elohim, and it shall remain there as a witness against you. So
but I agree with you.
For me, it's like so what do you, I'm trying to understand your point of view here. Hold on, wait.
My point of view is that we differ on what the word Torah actually means, and what it encompasses.
So you're saying that this scroll, or this, because we know there was no book at that time, so that's a bad translation, would be the scroll. What scroll do you think it's referring to then?
Could have been to the book of Deuteronomy, the retelling of the law. In other words, it's the law, the actual law, not the narrative of Noah's Ark, the narrative of the creation story, but the actual law. Now, so we even believe, I'm sure you believe, that Joshua wrote the last few verses of the Torah because Moses was dead, correct?
Well, it's in the book of Yehoshua, so it's not the Torah. He actually is reading the Torah.
No.
Yehoshua is not part of the Torah. That's the 6th book.
But the Torah mentions Moses' death, correct?
Yes.
Right, so who wrote that?
Well, I mean, we say Yehoshua.
Right, so we believe it was Joshua. Well, not too far-fetched to believe when the Torah says Torah, or when Tanakh says the statement Torah, does not necessarily mean the 5 books of the Torah, but what we call the Taryag Mitzvot, all the commandments within the actual Torah. But that's neither here or there. I mean, I think we agree more than we disagree in this area. I don't believe the oral law was something to be read in front of the people during Hakel every 7 years. The oral law, at least according to rabbinic tradition, was prohibited to be written down. In other words, because they were the rulings of legal cases, they had to remain fluent in a verbal manner because they changed. In other words, if the Sanhedrin ruled something permissible today, they could very well rule it not permissible tomorrow. So what's the point of writing it down? Jewish history teaches that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi wrote down the Mishnah or compiled the Mishnah because the Sanhedrin was about to be dismantled. The Jews were scattered, and the only way they could hold on to Torah in a uniform manner was by having these laws in written form. But before that, nobody claimed that it was in written form. Now, we believe that they were notes passed down to the students of the sages. But those notes, nobody walks around thinking that they're on any way on the level of Torah. Those notes were collected, and those are basically all the statements that appear in the Mishnah. That's it.
So I have a question for you. So, for example, in Devarim chapter 17, verses 18 through 19, where it says that when or if the king sits securely on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write a copy of this Torah for himself on a scroll, copy from the one kept by Kohanim of the tribe of Levi. What do you take that? I mean, I really want to hear your view. I want to hear your point of view on how you understand this. The claim of an oral Torah in general just says make a copy of this. What would he make a copy of, and what is
so the book of Deuteronomy is a rendition of the law. In other words, it's a retelling of the law. This is why, I mean, traditionally it was known as Mishneh Torah, Deuteronomy, the second Torah. I mean, Moses retelling the Torah. So this would be instructions already existed.
The copy would be of the Devarim? Is that what you're saying?
No, the copies would have been of the law. We're not sure exactly how that law was laid out, but to say that he had a command to write down the 5 books of Moses as we have them today and consider all that Torah, I disagree with that.
I respect that.
But simple fact,
I'm just saying,
but that it's referring to this law, and there's probably 10 more chapters in Deuteronomy. So that's true. That's neither here nor there. I don't think anyone knows exactly what law they had back then, but for sure, they didn't have the Torah as it was being lived out, so which is how some people think. Because the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and in some way they knew exactly what was going to happen, right? You know, because they had this like futuristic almanac in front of them, right? It just sounds funny. I mean, Torah means instructions. God spoke to the children of Israel on Mount Sinai, and all through the desert, He imparted to them His law, His instructions on how to live an ethical, moral life, and His ceremonial instructions on how to commune with Him. That's it. Now, if someone wants to include it all as Torah, that really doesn't make or break it. But I think that many times nowadays when they start bringing up books like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and they're finding similarities in the narrative that has nothing to do with the actual laws in the Torah, but in the narrative of the Torah. I mean, there's many people who walk around thinking, oh, so I thought all this was given exactly as we have it in the 5 books of Moses on Mount Sinai. So they'll drop it on that basis.
There's a lot of that nonsense going around.
The only divine portion in the Torah are the instructions. That's what makes it exceptional. I mean, anyone could create any other story on creation, on how a certain people came out of slavery. But what makes it unique is that it represents a good God with good instructions to help us live a richer, fuller life. And these instructions work. And this is why I'm religious, and I encourage other people to be religious. Not because of the stories in the book, but because this lifestyle, this individual moral training that's contained in those pages actually works.
No, I agree with that. You know, especially the morality and how, you know, they are to be taken as part of our daily life and to benefit ourselves. I'm with you 100%. I differ on things of, you know, for example, like science and their claims of how incorrect the Torah is. You know, I take Torah a lot more literal for a lot of things. That's a whole other subject in itself, but definitely controversial on my understanding of the Torah and the narrative of creation, because I, you know, did a lot of deep studies on these kind of things, and I think that the Torah, you know, is very literal. I just think that science is kind of turned us away from the truth, but far beyond. That's why we're so quick to dismiss the creation as a cute creation story and not take it as literal fact. And there's so many things. It's a whole other. Of course, I'm not going to get on another discussion, but it's a whole other thing.
So to give you the benefit of the doubt, it's true. Most Jews, I would say most Orthodox Jews nowadays, argue against what you're saying. They believe that there was some sort of oral Torah given all the way back to Abraham, that Abraham had two actual Torahs with him, an oral law and a written law. There are many Orthodox Jews who believe this, and this is what I think you're speaking against. And I speak against that as well, because I don't believe that the oral law was necessarily given on Mount Sinai. Now, there are some portions of oral law that had to be given to Moses somehow, right? But I just believe that in faith. I don't really necessarily think that it makes or breaks the religion.
Well, I could definitely respect that.
Jewish literature, there's something called Midrashim and Agadot, basically folklore and legend, that tries to put a spin on everything practical that appears in Torah. And this is one of the areas it spins, saying that the whole oral law was given on Mount Sinai. Look, even if the Sanhedrin came up with every letter of that oral tradition, we would still have to obey that Sanhedrin, assuming you believe it's the same Sanhedrin or the same court mentioned in Deuteronomy 17. If you don't believe that, then that's a different thing. But if you believe it's the same court, God tells us that we have to not stray from the right to the left from what that court instructs. And so whether that law was given on Mount Sinai or developed by the court, regardless, we have to keep that law.
Yeah.
Now, I think.
Well, I'm in agreement. Like I didn't agree with, for example, you spoke with another. I'm not going to mention his name, but I've had my talks with this guy as well. He's got real, he thinks he's authoritative on things he's not. But he basically was stating that there was no Sanhedrin and there was none of that. I don't believe that at all. It's nonsense. It's not historical. It's not legit at all. A lot of things he says is not legit. But one of the things that is true is that I do believe there was a Sanhedrin. It can't just be that there was nothing there. We know that there were Sadducees. There were many different sects that went to that temple.
Okay, so we'll differ who that Sanhedrin was. I mean, I have no problem with that. I mean, saying that.
No, I believe they were part of it. I mean, they were definitely part of that too. The Pharisaic, and as far as I'm not trying to say that they weren't part of that either. But for people to just dismiss the whole Sanhedrin, which I heard in one of the conversations, I think it's ridiculous because, I mean, even if there was no Kohanim that were proclaiming to be Kohanim, there has to be some kind of order, and I do agree with that. But who the order is, again, I disagree on certain things, but.
That really sums up what I believe. I mean, besides that, I don't think we have a disagreement.
Yeah.
I think our only difference is who I claim that Sanhedrin to be. I believe it was the rabbis in the Talmud. You could believe that it was the priest and it got dismantled and they didn't leave a written record. That's fine. That's where I always say that Karaite Judaism differs with Judaism just on one commandment. If they acknowledge that the Sanhedrin has full authority, we're just differing on who that Sanhedrin is. They believe that it was a Sanhedrin that ceased to exist.
This is something that I usually say. I want to know your thoughts on this. And of course, even if you think this makes sense, it doesn't mean that you agree. But I always pose this statement or question. If, let's just say, which we're going to get it, on my end, credibility that there was basically, I know you don't call it a second Torah because you think, respect that you don't call it a second Torah, but more like the rabbinical instructions, right?
When do you think the first time the oral law was rejected?
Well, I can't really put a date on that, in general, but I know that throughout history, I don't have a security. I know sometimes
Karaites claim to be the successors to the Sadducees. So, the New Testament in some parts of
not really. No. We're not the successors of Sadducees. We're usually lumped into that category, but we know that the Sadducees only kept the 5 books of Moshe, which is kind of similar to what the Samaritans do. Of course, they have their own Torah, version of Torah.
That's what I disagree with. I mean, I don't believe that the Sadducees only kept the 5 books of Moses. That's a Christian understanding, and kind of a quick reading of Josephus, but he didn't even believe that. Mainly because the Sadducees also sat on the Sanhedrin. And the Sadducees
what sources do you have that they kept the whole Tanakh?
That they didn't?
Or I'm sorry, no, I mean where can I look into other information, Thomas?
All we know about the Sadducees is what we hear in Josephus and in the New Testament and in the Talmud.
And the Talmud, yeah.
So Josephus says that they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, They didn't believe in an afterlife, right? Or I believe maybe the New Testament references them not believing in an afterlife, that any reward they get on this earth. And I don't think that necessarily goes against the oral law in any way, because the oral law is about law. It's not about belief. Now, because the Sadducees themselves sat on the Sanhedrin, and the priesthood was traditionally part of that Sanhedrin and even ran the Sanhedrin, meant that they had nothing against rabbinical rulings. But in my opinion, what they differed with was the traditions of the rabbis, which are legends and tales,
that was
but
from
not
Babylon,
in a sense of order.
But do you believe that some of those traditions at the time, for example, 2,000 years ago, before 70 AD, do you believe that some of those traditions were picked up, you personally, from the Babylonian exile, possibly?
Yeah, absolutely. Even our calendar.
Yeah.
If you look at our Jewish calendar, the vast majority of the names are pagan names that are identical. They're identical to the Babylonian calendar. So it's, I mean, we brought things from Babylon, and the rabbis even say it. Even the Ramban, Nachmanides, says the reason we have these pagan names in our calendar is to remind us of the exile we were in that pagan nation. But not necessarily that we elevate Tammuz, as anything, right? So,
and they weren't really applauding it, like they were looking at it as something that like persecution.
Traditions, outside traditions, have always been creeping into Judaism. But being that the Sadducees were part of the ruling class, they weren't against organized religion and rules and laws to govern a society. As a matter of fact, priests needed some consensus to be able to act out the services properly in the temple. That's not clear in the Torah, right? I mean, they had to have some consensus on how these things are done. And that is what my group understands as the oral law. Now, all the traditions of heaven and hell and all this stuff, this is secondary and it's optional to believe. And the Torah itself doesn't mention hell. It doesn't mention heaven.
On all that,
right? I mean, it doesn't mention, it doesn't mention the resurrection of the dead. Don't forget, Israel back then was a country where, even though it was occupied by Rome, it needed laws to run. And civil law is what rabbinic law is. In other words, on how to keep Torah in Israel, in other words, gray area. I'm pretty sure that any Karaite would not have a problem with that explanation that appear in the Talmud that have nothing to do with law. Things about the afterlife, demons, and all that nonsense, which are optional to believe. But the simple fact that the rabbis in the Talmud contradict themselves on all these mystical opinions shows that they don't claim those opinions to come from a divine source. So my discussion with the Karaite guy that I spoke to last week, he knew that the only way to disprove my argument is to say that the Sanhedrin never existed. Because if it did exist, then he would be bound to accept it. Or maybe he could have said, it did exist, but I just don't believe that the rabbis in the Talmud were that Sanhedrin. Fine. I mean, he could believe that. That is for sure something I believe in faith. Apart from the Torah given on Mount Sinai, God's instructions on Mount Sinai, I believe that there were actual 6 days of creation and God rested on the seventh, and I believe that the Sanhedrin of the Torah, or the court that's mentioned in the Torah, are the same rabbis in the Talmud who claim to belong in that court. These are all statements of faith.
Yeah, one of the things that, for me, of course, this is definitely a controversial, path to go on, especially among a lot of Karaites and, of course, Orthodox as well, and probably every sect, because everybody buys in blindly to the science that we're being fed from school time till now. I have my views based on actual evidence. Of course, people don't like that. They don't want to go off the page, but I have my own understanding, like very, very literal on the creation and what the earth is, and it's very, definitely controversial, and it is my views, but I base it completely on Tanakh, and it's really illuminating, if anything, to the journey of understanding Tanakh, to know the real truth about the creation, what we live in. And a lot of people feel like it's not really important, whatever it is, but for me, the countless number of times that God refers to the creation and what we're actually in is important, because he mentioned it so many times, and it's so contrary to what we're taught in science. And there's so many passages that just will make you just boggle your mind, because it just does not fit with the science that we're being taught today. It just doesn't match, because bottom line is what they're teaching in science is based on, Big Bang, the earth is not important, you're just calling it a planet. It's such a mockery of God's creation. It's sick, really. That's just my view, but there's so many things that I wish I could open up more with more individuals within Karaism and Orthodox, because it's very illuminating. And that would be one of the greatest things, because there's a lot of mention in the Talmud in general about the term universe. But there's no mention of that in anything in the Torah or Tanakh anywhere. And this is, I don't want to go down a path that's, not what our discussion is about, but there is
I don't try to justify non-legal statements in the Talmud. I'm sure there's beautiful statements in the Talmud and there's silly statements in the Talmud, right? But if they're not dealing with law, we don't have to obey it, because the court mentioned in Deuteronomy 17 deals with things that we have to do, not things we have to believe. So if some rabbi told you this individual is the Messiah, you could be like, okay, fine. And that's a secondary belief. It's optional to believe. But if that court tells you, we ruled that this is how Shabbat should be kept, right, and they're not breaking any Torah commands, that is what that court's here for. But to tell us about demons or about reincarnation or splitting God up into 10 pieces, all that nonsense, that's optional to believe. It's not necessarily wrong, but because it's not in Scripture, it's not divinely inspired. Because anything mystical...
you got to go with what's in Scripture. Exactly.
If it's mystical, it has to come directly from God. Because He's the only one that would have that knowledge. Right? Because no one died and come back again.
Yeah, and the problem with, in general, the consensus of the Talmudic teachings and things in general is that consensus is, well, at least from the I know not from you, of course. So, for example, when it says statements for example, if the rabbi tells you that your right foot is really your left, or, put on this shoe first or something like that, that's not based on Torah. That would be
right. That's not in the Talmud, actually. That's in later Kabbalistic literature.
So that would be something you wouldn't agree with in general?
That would be something I would not agree with, because it's mystically inclined. Okay. This is to fool the demons. They say that you have to put this shoe on first and all that nonsense. That has nothing to do with law. The job of this court was to translate Torah laws, and then also to build fences around the Torah to help us keep it in a uniform manner, but not to tell us anything about the metaphysical or how to alter or tap into the metaphysical, which does appear in the Talmud, but you don't have to believe.
I can't stick my nose where it doesn't belong here in general, but it seems like a consensus that, I've seen some of the attacks on you, personal attacks and things, and I think that it's really, their attacks are simply just insults instead of what are you actually teaching and what are you saying. I think that this is really helpful to have conversations like these to understand.
The reason there's a Karaite movement to begin with is because we haven't made a distinction between what's law or a translation of the law, an application of the law, and mysticism. Because virtually every statement that I see Karaites make on why they disagree with the Talmud, it's outlandish things that I also disagree with. And many rabbis will disagree with also. Only because it says it in the Talmud does not mean that we elevate it. Now, I heard Nehemiah Gordon once say a statement that we believe that the whole Talmud was given on Mount Sinai. I mean, there are some Jews who believe that. But the vast majority of rabbis do not believe that the whole Talmud was given on Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
Of course, if someone is looking...
That would be insane to you.
To what group of Judaism to join, they're not going to join that group.